Sometimes the most broken hearts find each other in the darkest moments. Sometimes a stranger's desperation becomes the very thing that saves us all. In 1874 Wyoming, mountain man Elias Crow lived alone in his cabin, wanting nothing from the world. Then, one winter night, a dying woman and her little girl collapsed at his door. The child was so scared of losing her mother that she made a heartbreaking offer to this rough stranger. She grabbed his hands and begged him with words no child should ever have to say. What she offered wasn't what anyone would think. It was just pure desperation from a little heart that couldn't bear to be left alone. Elias had forgotten how to care about people. But something about this child's plea changed everything. Could a man who had shut out the world save a stranger's life when death seemed certain? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled through the pines like a lost soul, carrying snow that cut like glass across the Wyoming peaks. February of 1874 had been the harshest winter Elias Crow could remember in his 15 years on this mountain, and that was saying something for a man who had weathered more storms than he cared to count. His cabin sat perched on a natural shelf of rock, 3,000 feet above the valley floor, accessible only by a treacherous trail that most sensible folk wouldn't attempt even in good weather. That was exactly how Elias liked it. The structure itself was solid, hewn from lodgepole pine and chinked with mud and moss, built to last against whatever nature might throw at it. A stone chimney rose from one end, sending a steady stream of smoke into the grey sky, the only sign of human habitation for miles in any direction. Inside, the single room held everything a man needed to survive, and nothing more. A rough-hewn table sat near the stone fireplace, flanked by one chair that Elias had carved himself. A narrow bed occupied the far corner, covered with elk hide and wool blankets that had seen better years. Shelves lined one wall, holding his meager supplies: salt pork, beans, flour in tin containers, and a small collection of medicines he'd learned to prepare from mountain plants. A few tools hung from pegs driven into the log walls: an axe, a saw, traps for small game, and the Winchester rifle that had kept him alive through more troubles than he liked to remember. Elias himself was a man shaped by solitude and hardship. At 41, his face bore the deep lines that came from squinting against snow glare and mountain sun. His beard, more grey than brown now, hung to his chest, and his hair reached his shoulders, both kept neat enough, but showing a man who had no mirror and little concern for appearances. His hands were scarred from years of rough work, calloused and strong, capable of splitting wood or setting a bone with equal skill. He stood just over 6 feet, lean but solid, moving with the careful economy of someone who understood that wasted motion could mean the difference between life and death in this unforgiving country. This particular evening found him returning from his woodshed, arms full of split pine, when he noticed the shapes near his door. At first, he thought they might be fallen branches blown by the wind. Then one of the shapes moved, and Elias dropped his load of firewood. 2 figures huddled against his cabin wall, a woman and a child, both so still they might have been frozen solid. The woman lay on her side, one arm wrapped protectively around the little girl, who pressed close against her mother's body. Snow had begun to cover them both. Elias approached slowly, his mountain-bred caution warring with something else, something he hadn't felt in years. The woman was unconscious, her breathing shallow and rapid. Even in the dim light, he could see the flush of fever on her pale cheeks. She was perhaps 30, with dark hair that had escaped from a simple braid. Her dress, once a practical blue calico, was torn and stained. On her feet were shoes more suited to town streets than mountain trails. The child, a girl of maybe 8 or 9, stirred as Elias knelt beside them. Her eyes opened, revealing the same dark brown as her mother's, but filled with a terror and desperation that struck Elias like a physical blow. She couldn't have weighed more than 60 pounds, thin from hunger and exhaustion, but she positioned herself between Elias and her mother with the fierce protectiveness of a she-wolf. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind, "please don't hurt us." Elias found himself speaking more gently than he had to another human being in years. "I'm not going to hurt you, child. What are you doing up here?" The girl's eyes darted between Elias's face and her mother's still form. "Mama's sick, real sick. We were running, and she just fell down. I tried to wake her up, but she won't." Her voice broke, and tears began to freeze on her cheeks. Without another word, Elias scooped the woman into his arms. She was lighter than she should have been, all sharp angles beneath the worn fabric of her dress. The child scrambled to her feet and followed as he carried her mother inside. The warmth of the cabin must have been overwhelming after the bitter cold. Elias laid the woman on his own bed, the only soft surface in the room, and quickly built up the fire until it roared in the stone hearth. The child stood near the door, shivering violently, watching every move he made. "What's your name?" Elias asked as he pulled his heaviest blankets over the woman. "Lucy," she said, then added with careful politeness, "Lucy Monroe. This is my mama, Clara. I'm Elias." He moved to his shelves, gathering what medical supplies he had. "How long has your mother been sick?" 3 days, maybe 4. "Since we left," Lucy stopped herself, some instinct warning her not to say too much. Elias didn't press. He'd learned long ago that people had their reasons for keeping secrets, especially people who ended up on his mountain in the dead of winter. Instead, he focused on Clara Monroe. Her fever was dangerously high, her pulse too rapid and weak. Through the torn fabric of her dress, he could see that she was thinner than any woman should be, as if she and her daughter had been surviving on very little for quite some time. He mixed willow bark tea for the fever and managed to get a few spoonfuls down Clara's throat. She stirred slightly at the bitter taste, but didn't wake. Her breathing was labored, and Elias found himself remembering skills he'd hoped never to need again, things he'd learned in another life, when he'd been responsible for more than just himself. Lucy had crept closer to the fire, still watching him with those enormous, frightened eyes. Now that she was in the light, Elias could see she was older than he'd first thought, maybe 9 or 10, but small for her age. Her dark hair was tangled and dirty, and her dress was as worn and travel-stained as her mother's. She clutched something in her small hands, a carved wooden doll, crude but lovingly made, with yarn hair and a painted face. "Are you hungry?" Elias asked. Lucy nodded but didn't move toward him. Elias went to his stores and put together a simple meal, beans and salt pork, biscuits made from his dwindling flour supply. As the smell of cooking food filled the cabin, Lucy's reserve began to crack. She edged closer, drawn by hunger that was clearly gnawing at her. "When did you last eat?" Elias asked, ladling food onto one of his 2 plates. "Yesterday morning," Lucy said, then corrected herself. "I think it was yesterday. Mama had some hardtack, but she gave it to me." Elias set the plate on his table and gestured for her to sit. Lucy hesitated for a moment, then climbed onto the chair and began to eat with the desperate efficiency of someone who had learned not to take food for granted. As she ate, some of the tension left her thin shoulders, and she began to look around the cabin with curious eyes. "Do you live here all by yourself?" she asked between bites. "I do. Don't you get lonely?" The question caught Elias off guard. He'd been alone so long that loneliness had become like the cold, something he simply endured without thinking about it. "I manage," he said finally. Lucy considered this while chewing thoughtfully on a biscuit. "Mama says everybody needs somebody. She says that's how God made us, to be together." Elias had no answer for that. He turned his attention back to Clara, checking her fever and adjusting the blankets around her. She was still unconscious, lost in whatever fever dreams had claimed her. In the firelight, he could see that she might have been pretty once, before hunger and fear had carved hollows in her cheeks and left dark circles under her eyes. "Where are you from?" he asked Lucy. "Down in the valley. We had a little place near Willow Creek." Lucy's voice grew smaller. But the bad men came and burned it down. Mama grabbed me and we ran, but they chased us. We hid in the rocks for 2 days, and then Mama got sick. What bad men? Lucy's eyes darted to her mother's still form, then back to Elias. I'm not supposed to talk about it. Mama said if anyone asks, I should say we got lost. Elias felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same feeling he'd had years ago when trouble was riding toward his door. But that was another life, one he'd left behind when he climbed this mountain and decided to stay. He wasn't a lawman anymore. He wasn't responsible for protecting anyone but himself. Still, as he looked at this child, barely more than a baby, really trying to protect her unconscious mother from dangers she didn't fully understand, something stirred in him that he'd thought was long dead. Your mama's pretty sick, he said gently. I've got some medicine, and the fever might break, but she has to get better, Lucy interrupted, her voice fierce despite its trembling. She has to. I don't have anybody else. The words hung in the air between them, and Elias saw his own reflection in the child's desperate eyes, the same fear, the same loneliness, the same determination to hold on to the only thing that mattered. For a moment, he was transported back 15 years, to another winter night when he'd held his own sick child and bargained with God for just one more day, one more chance. Lucy slid down from the chair and approached the bed where her mother lay. She placed her small hand on Clara's forehead, checking for fever the way she'd probably seen adults do. The simple gold band on Clara's finger caught the firelight, a wedding ring, worn thin from years of wear. Mama, Lucy whispered, we found help. This nice man is going to make you better. She looked up at Elias with such complete faith that it nearly undid him. How long had it been since anyone had looked at him that way? How long since he'd been someone worth believing in? I'll do everything I can, he promised, and meant it more than he'd expected to. The wind continued to howl outside, driving snow against the cabin's sturdy walls. Inside, the fire crackled, and warmth slowly filled the small space. Clara Monroe lay unconscious, fighting a fever that might yet claim her. Her daughter sat beside the bed, still clutching her wooden doll, watching her mother's face for any sign of improvement. And Elias Crow, who had spent 15 years running from the pain of caring about other people, found himself once again responsible for lives other than his own. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd come to this mountain to escape from exactly this kind of situation. Now it had found him anyway, delivered to his door by the same harsh winter that had been his protection against the world below. As the night deepened and the storm raged on, Elias settled into his chair to keep watch over his unexpected guests. Outside, the mountain slept under its blanket of snow, indifferent to human struggles. Inside, 3 people strangers just hours before began the delicate process of becoming something more. None of them knew yet what the morning would bring, or whether Clara Monroe would live to see another dawn. But for the first time in 15 years, Elias Crow wasn't entirely alone. The first crisis came just before dawn. Elias woke from his chair to find Lucy shaking her mother desperately, tears streaming down her face. She won't wake up, Lucy sobbed. I tried and tried, but she won't wake up. Clara's fever had spiked during the night. Her skin burned to the touch, and her breathing had become rapid and shallow. Worse, she'd begun to convulse, her body racked with tremors that made the simple bed frame creak ominously. Elias had seen this before, years ago, and knew what it meant. Without immediate intervention, Clara Monroe would be dead before the sun cleared the peaks. Lucy, I need you to help me, he said, forcing calm into his voice. Can you do that? The child nodded, wiping her nose on her sleeve. What do I do? Get me snow from outside. A potful. Hurry. While Lucy scrambled to obey, Elias gathered every scrap of cloth he could find. Clara's body temperature had to come down, and fast. He'd lost someone this way before, someone he'd loved more than life itself, and he'd sworn never to feel that helpless again. Lucy returned with the snow, her small hands red from the cold. Together, they packed it around Clara's burning body, changing it out as it melted. Elias forced more willow bark tea down her throat, added feverfew and elderberry, everything he knew that might help. "Is she going to die?" Lucy asked in a small voice. Elias wanted to lie, to offer false comfort, but something in the child's eyes stopped him. She'd already seen too much, lost too much. She deserved honesty. "I don't know," he said, "but I'm going to fight like hell to keep her here." As if responding to his words, Clara's eyes fluttered open. They were unfocused, bright with fever, but aware. She tried to speak, but only managed a weak croak. "Mama!" Lucy grabbed her mother's hand. "You're awake!" Clara's gaze slowly found her daughter's face, then drifted to Elias. For a moment, confusion clouded her features. Where was she? Who was this bearded stranger? Then memory seemed to return, and with it, fear. "Lucy," she whispered, struggling to sit up, "we have to go. They'll find us." "You're not going anywhere," Elias said firmly, pressing her back down. "You're barely alive as it is." "You don't understand." Clara's voice was urgent despite its weakness. "They burned our house, killed our neighbors. They're looking for me, and if they find me here—" She tried again to rise, but the effort sent her into another convulsion. Lucy cried out in alarm as her mother's body went rigid, her eyes rolling back. "Tell me," Elias said as he held Clara steady, waiting for the seizure to pass. "Tell me who's after you." When Clara could speak again, her words came in broken fragments. She and her late husband had owned a small ranch in the valley. 3 months ago, a group of men had approached them, wanting to buy their land for far less than it was worth. When they refused to sell, the men had grown threatening. "They said they'd be back," Clara whispered, "but we thought James thought they were just trying to scare us." 2 weeks ago, her husband James had ridden to town for supplies and never returned. His body was found 3 days later, shot in the back. The same day, their neighbor's barn had burned down, and the message was clear: sell or suffer the consequences. "I was packing to leave," Clara continued, her voice growing weaker, "taking Lucy to my sister in Colorado. But they came back before I could go. 6 of them, riding hard. They burned the house, shot our livestock. We barely got away." Elias felt the familiar cold fury settling in his chest, the same anger that had once driven him to pin a badge to his shirt and ride after men who preyed on the innocent. But that was 15 years ago. He was different now. Older. Alone. By choice. "What did they want with your land?" he asked. "I don't know." James said there was talk of a railroad coming through, but Clara's words were cut off by another convulsion, this one lasting longer than the others. When it passed, she grabbed Elias's wrist with surprising strength. "Don't let them find her," she pleaded. "If something happens to me, don't let them take Lucy, promise me." Lucy had been listening to this exchange with growing alarm. Now she threw herself across her mother's body, as if she could hold her to this world through sheer force of will. "You're not going to die," she declared. "You can't. I need you." Clara managed to stroke her daughter's hair with a trembling hand. "Baby, sometimes we don't get to choose." "No." Lucy's voice cracked with desperation. She turned to Elias, her small face streaked with tears. "Please, sir, please save her. If you can save my mama, she'll warm your bed, she'll take care of you, and cook for you, and you won't be lonely anymore." The words hit Elias like a physical blow. This child, barely 9 years old, was trying to bargain away her mother's virtue to a stranger, not out of wickedness, but out of pure, desperate love. She understood so little about what she was offering, yet she was willing to promise anything, everything, if it would keep her mother alive. "Lucy, no," Clara breathed, mortified even in her fevered state. But Elias saw something else in the child's plea, not an offer of flesh, but the raw cry of a heart that couldn't bear to be left alone in a world that had already taken so much from her. She was offering the only thing she thought might have value to a man, the promise that he wouldn't have to face his own loneliness. "Lucy," he said gently, kneeling so that he was at her eye level, "I don't want your mama to warm my bed. But I'll tell you what I will do. I'll fight death itself to keep her here with you, not because of anything you can give me, but because no little girl should have to face this world alone." Something in his voice must have convinced her, because Lucy threw her arms around his neck and sobbed against his shoulder. "Promise. I promise." It was a vow that would change everything. In that moment, Elias felt 15 years of carefully constructed isolation crumble away. He was no longer a hermit hiding from the world. He was a protector again, responsible for these two fragile lives that had stumbled into his sanctuary. Clara's condition stabilized somewhat as the day wore on, but she remained weak and feverish. Elias took turns between caring for her and keeping watch at the windows. If these men were truly hunting Clara and Lucy, they might have tracked them this far. His cabin was remote, but not impossible to find for determined trackers. As evening approached, he made a decision that would have been unthinkable just 24 hours earlier. He pulled out a wooden box from beneath his bed, a container he hadn't opened in years. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather, lay the tools of his former trade. A Colt .tot .45 revolver, a deputy marshal's badge, and several wanted posters with names and faces he'd hoped never to see again. Among those papers was something else, torn pages from what looked like a woman's journal, the ink faded but still legible. The handwriting was feminine, educated, and the words spoke of fear and desperation. "They came again today," one entry read. "James tried to stand up to them, but I could see he was frightened. The leader, the one they call Cutter, he looked at Lucy in a way that made my skin crawl. We have to leave. We have to run." Another page. "James is dead. I know it, even though they haven't found his body yet. Cutter's men were asking questions in town, and Mrs. Henley said she saw them riding toward our place yesterday. Lucy doesn't know yet. How do I tell my baby that her papa isn't coming home?" The final entry, written in a shaking hand, "They're coming. I can see the dust from their horses. Lucy is hiding in the root cellar like I taught her. If we don't make it, if someone finds this, their leader is Jake Cutter. He's the one responsible. He's the one who killed my James and destroyed our lives. Don't let him get away with it." Elias felt the old fire kindling in his chest as he read Clara's desperate words. Jake Cutter. The name meant nothing to him, but the type certainly did. He'd spent years hunting men like Cutter predators who used fear and violence to take what wasn't theirs. Lucy was curled up beside her mother, both of them finally sleeping peacefully. Clara's fever had broken, and her breathing was easier. She would live. Elias was certain of that now. But living and being safe were two different things entirely. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering any tracks that might lead these Cutter and his men to the cabin. But winter wouldn't last forever, and when spring came, the hunt would begin again. Elias knew men like Cutter didn't give up easily, especially when there were witnesses to their crimes. He looked at the badge in his hand, tarnished silver, that had once meant everything to him. He'd thrown it away 15 years ago, along with everything else that had mattered in his old life. Now, holding it again, he felt the weight of responsibility settling back onto his shoulders. Clara Monroe and her daughter had stumbled into his carefully ordered world and shattered his comfortable isolation. But perhaps that wasn't entirely a bad thing. Perhaps it was time to remember what it felt like to fight for something beyond mere survival. The snow fell harder as night deepened, and somewhere in the darkness below, dangerous men might even now be planning their next move. But in the warmth of his cabin, surrounded by the gentle breathing of the two people he'd sworn to protect, Elias Crow began to plan as well. Some men, he'd learned long ago, only understood one kind of language, and it had been years since he'd spoken it fluently, but he hadn't forgotten the words. Over the next 3 days, Elias discovered that caring for other people required skills he'd nearly forgotten. Clara's recovery was slow but steady, though she remained weak and easily tired. The fever had broken, but it had taken a toll on her already undernourished body. She slept most of the time, waking only to sip the broths Elias prepared or to reassure herself that Lucy was safe. Lucy, meanwhile, had begun to emerge from her shell of terror. The constant fear that had kept her rigid and watchful slowly gave way to the natural curiosity of a child. She followed Elias around the cabin, asking endless questions about everything from how he'd built the furniture to why he lived alone on the mountain. "Don't you miss talking to people?" she asked one morning as Elias checked his small supply of medicines. "I talk to you," he replied, measuring out willow bark for another batch of tea. "That's different. I mean grown-up people, people who remember the same things you do." The observation was surprisingly astute for a 9-year-old. Elias paused in his measuring, thinking about how to answer. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but missing something and needing it aren't the same thing." Lucy considered this while helping him sort through his collection of herbs and roots. His medicine bag, a worn leather pouch he'd carried since his early days, as a lawman, contained a mixture of traditional remedies and things he'd learned from an old Shoshone medicine man years ago. Willow bark for fever, elderberry for strength, pine needle tea for the cough that sometimes followed winter illnesses. "Mama knows about medicine too," Lucy said. "She helped birth babies back home, and she could set bones and such. Maybe when she's better, she could help you learn more things." The casual way Lucy spoke of their future together struck Elias oddly. The child seemed to have decided, without any discussion, that they would all be staying together. She talked about when spring comes and next winter, as if it were already settled that they would face these seasons as a family. Clara's first real conversation came on the 4th day. She woke in the afternoon looking more alert than she had since arriving, her eyes clear and focused. Lucy was outside gathering snow for their water supply, leaving the two adults alone for the first time. "I don't know how to thank you," Clara said, her voice still weak but steady. "Lucy told me what you did, how you saved my life." "You don't need to thank me." "I do, though." Clara struggled to sit up, and Elias moved to help her, propping pillows behind her back. "I heard what Lucy said to you, about warming your bed. I'm so sorry. She's just a child. She doesn't understand." "I know what she meant," Elias interrupted gently. "And it wasn't what you think. She was trying to offer me something she thought I might want: companionship. She sees I'm alone and thinks that must be the same as being lonely." Clara studied his face. "Isn't it?" The question caught him off guard. "I chose this life. That doesn't answer my question." Before Elias could respond, Lucy burst through the door, carrying a pot of fresh snow, her cheeks red from the cold. "Mama, you're sitting up." The conversation was forgotten as Lucy flung herself into her mother's arms. Clara held her daughter tight, and Elias saw tears in her eyes, whether from joy at being alive or sorrow at how close they'd come to losing each other. He couldn't tell. That evening, as Clara felt strong enough to sit at the table for supper, she told him more about their life before the trouble started. She and James had been married young, homesteading their small ranch when Lucy was just a baby. It had been a good life, if not an easy one. James had been a gentleman, better with animals than people, who'd loved his wife and daughter with quiet devotion. "He never would have fought back," Clara said, staring into her cup of pine needle tea. "That's what makes this so senseless. If they'd just waited, if they'd given us time, we would have sold. We couldn't fight men like that." "What exactly did they want with your land?" Elias asked. "We never knew for certain. James heard rumors about a railroad company looking to buy up the whole valley, but there were other stories too. Some said there was silver in the hills above our place. Others thought it might be about water rights." Clara shrugged. "Does it matter? They wanted it, and they took it." Lucy had been listening to this conversation with the intense focus children brought to adult matters they didn't fully understand. Now she spoke up. "Mama, are we going to build a new house?" Clara's face fell. "Baby, I don't know. We don't have any money left. Everything we owned was in that house. And we could build it here, Lucy said matter-of-factly. Mr. Elias has lots of room, and he could teach us how to cut trees and make boards and everything. Lucy, we can't just... Why not? The child looked between the two adults with genuine confusion. Mr. Elias is all alone, and we don't have anywhere to go. Mama, you said God puts people together when they need each other. Maybe that's what happened. Elias found himself caught between admiration for the child's logic and alarm at how easily she'd rearranged all their lives. Lucy, your mama might want to go to her sister in Colorado, like she planned. Do you want us to go away? Lucy asked, her lower lip trembling slightly. The question hung in the air between them. Did he want them to go? A week ago, the answer would have been obvious. Now, looking at this small girl who'd somehow decided he was family, and at her mother who was watching him with quiet intensity, Elias wasn't sure anymore. It's not about what I want, he said finally. It's about what's safest for you. But those bad men might follow us to Colorado, Lucy pointed out. And Aunt Sarah doesn't know how to shoot guns or set traps or anything. You do. You could protect us. Clara reached over to smooth her daughter's hair. Lucy, you can't just adopt people like a stray kitten. Mr. Crow has his own life. What life? Lucy interrupted with the brutal honesty of childhood. He doesn't talk to anybody or go anywhere or do anything except live all by himself. That's not a life. That's just waiting. The silence that followed was profound. Even Lucy seemed to realize she'd said something significant, though she probably didn't understand exactly what. Elias felt exposed, as if this 9-year-old child had seen straight through 15 years of careful self-deception to the truth underneath. Clara broke the silence first. Lucy, apologize. That was rude. No, Elias said quietly. She's not wrong. He rose from the table and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered wilderness that had been his whole world for so long. In the glass, he could see the reflection of the warm room behind him, Clara and Lucy at his table, the fire burning in his hearth, the simple domestic scene he'd told himself he didn't want or need. I came up here to get away from caring about people, he said without turning around. After my family died, I thought it would be easier to just not feel anything for anybody ever again. What happened to them? Clara asked gently. Elias closed his eyes, the old pain still sharp after all these years. Cholera, my wife Sarah, and our daughter Emma. She was about Lucy's age. He paused, struggling with words he'd never spoken aloud. I was a deputy marshal then, always traveling, always chasing outlaws. I was gone when they got sick, and by the time I made it home... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I'm sorry, Clara whispered. I blamed myself. Thought if I'd been there, if I'd been the husband and father they deserved instead of always putting the job first. Elias shook his head. So I quit, came up here. Figured if I didn't care about anybody, I couldn't lose anybody. Lucy had slipped down from her chair and come to stand beside him at the window. She slipped her small hand into his much larger one, her fingers warm despite the cold that seeped through the glass. You can't stop caring about people, she said with 9-year-old certainty. It's like trying to stop breathing. You can do it for a little while, but eventually you have to start again, or you die. Elias looked down at her serious little face, then at Clara, who was watching them both with tears in her eyes. Perhaps the child was right. Perhaps 15 years of holding his breath had been long enough. Outside, the wind continued to blow, and somewhere in the vast darkness, dangerous men might still be hunting. But inside the cabin, something new was taking root, fragile as a spring seedling, but growing stronger with each passing hour. For the first time since Sarah and Emma had died, Elias Crow was beginning to remember what it felt like to belong to something larger than his own solitude. The wooden doll had seen better days. Lucy clutched it constantly, and Elias could see where the paint had worn off its simple face from countless hours of handling. The yarn hair was tangled, and one of its carved arms had been mended with careful stitches of brown thread. "Papa made her for me," Lucy said one morning, holding the doll up for Elias to examine. "Her name is Sarah, like your wife." The coincidence struck Elias like a physical blow. He'd mentioned his late wife's name only once, but Lucy had remembered. "That's a pretty name. Papa wasn't very good at carving, but he tried real hard. See? Her face is a little crooked, but I think that makes her special." Lucy smoothed the doll's tangled yarn hair with gentle fingers. "Mama says we keep the people we love alive by remembering them. Do you remember your Sarah? Every day. What was she like?" Elias found himself describing his late wife to this earnest child, how Sarah had laughed at his terrible jokes, how she'd sung while she worked, how she'd made their small house feel like the center of the world. He talked about Emma too, their daughter who'd been fearless and curious, always asking questions and getting into harmless mischief. Lucy listened with the intense attention children gave to stories about other children. Emma sounds like she was brave. She was, sometimes too brave for her own good. "Like me," Elias smiled. Clara had been growing stronger each day, able to stay awake for longer periods and even help with simple tasks around the cabin. She proved to be handy with domestic skills. Elias had nearly forgotten mending his clothes with neat stitches, organizing his supplies more efficiently, preparing meals that actually tasted like something other than survival. "You've been living like a bachelor hermit," she teased gently one afternoon as she watched him attempt to cook. "When's the last time you had a proper meal?" "I eat fine. Salt pork and beans every day isn't eating fine, it's just staying alive." Clara took over the cooking, somehow transforming his basic ingredients into something that smelled like home. "A man needs variety, needs proper nutrition. No wonder you look half-starved. I look exactly how a mountain man is supposed to look. You look like someone who's forgotten how to take care of himself." It was true, though Elias wouldn't admit it. 15 years of solitude had stripped away many of the small comforts that made life more than mere existence. He'd forgotten the pleasure of a well-prepared meal, the satisfaction of clean clothes, the simple contentment of evening conversation by the fire. With Clara and Lucy in his cabin, these forgotten pleasures began to return. Lucy would curl up beside the fire with her doll, telling elaborate stories about the adventures they'd had together. Clara would sit nearby, mending or sorting supplies, occasionally adding details to Lucy's tales that made them both laugh. "Tell about the time Sarah fought the bear," Lucy would say, and Clara would spin a story about the brave wooden doll who'd protected a family of rabbits from a fearsome grizzly, armed with nothing but courage and a very sharp stick. Elias found himself drawn into these evening rituals, almost against his will. He'd sit in his chair, ostensibly checking his traps or cleaning his rifle, but really just listening to the sound of their voices filling his silent cabin with warmth and life. "Do you have any stories about when you were little?" Lucy asked him one evening. Elias had to think about it. His childhood seemed like something that had happened to someone else, buried under years of hard living and deliberate forgetting. But slowly, prompted by Lucy's endless questions, he began to remember. He told them about growing up on a farm in Missouri, about his father teaching him to track and hunt, about the time he'd tried to tame a wild raccoon and ended up getting bitten for his trouble. Clara laughed at his stories, and Lucy hung on every word, and Elias realized he'd been storing up these memories for years without anyone to share them with. "Why did you become a lawman?" Clara asked. "Seemed like the right thing to do." There weren't many people willing to stand up to the bad men back then, and I was young enough to think I could make a difference. "Did you make a difference?" Elias considered the question. Sometimes, not always, not when it mattered most. The weight of old failures settled on his shoulders, but Lucy wouldn't let him stay lost in dark thoughts. "You made a difference for us," she said simply. "You saved Mama's life." "That's different." "How?" "Because—" Elias stopped, realizing he didn't have a good answer. How was it different? He'd used the same skills, made the same choice to help people in danger. The only difference was that this time he'd been trying to save people who'd become important to him personally. Clara seemed to understand his confusion. "Maybe the mistake isn't caring about people," she said quietly. "Maybe the mistake is thinking you can save everyone." It was a distinction that had never occurred to him. For 15 years, he'd believed his failure to save Sarah and Emma meant he shouldn't try to save anyone. But perhaps Clara was right. Perhaps the answer wasn't to stop caring, but to care more carefully, more deliberately. As the days passed, they settled into routines that felt surprisingly natural. Elias would check his snares and tend to outdoor chores, while Clara and Lucy managed the domestic tasks. They'd share meals and stories, and in the evenings, they'd sit by the fire while Lucy played with her doll and Clara worked on various projects. She'd found his sewing kit and taken it upon herself to repair years of hasty mending and bachelor carelessness. His shirts suddenly had all their buttons. His trousers no longer had patches held on with rough stitches. Even his heavy coat received attention, its torn places carefully repaired and reinforced. "You don't have to do that," he protested. "I want to. You've done so much for us. This is the least I can do in return. You don't owe me anything." Clara looked up from her mending, studying his face in the firelight. "Maybe not, but taking care of people isn't always about owing them something. Sometimes it's just about wanting them to be comfortable and happy." The concept was foreign to Elias. 15 years of solitude had taught him to think in terms of necessity and survival. The idea that someone might do something simply because they wanted him to be happy was almost incomprehensible. "Besides," Clara added with a small smile, "if we're going to be living here—" "Are we?" Elias interrupted. "Living here?" The question had been hanging unspoken between them for days. Clara set down her mending and looked at him seriously. "I don't know," she admitted. "I suppose that depends on you. Lucy seems to have decided we're staying, but Lucy's 9 years old. She doesn't understand all the complications." "What complications?" "Well, for one thing, people will talk. A widow and her child living alone with an unmarried man, even up here, that sort of thing gets noticed eventually." Elias hadn't considered that. Does it matter what people think? It might matter to Lucy when she's older. Children can be cruel about things like that. They sat in silence for a while, both lost in thought. Lucy had fallen asleep by the fire, her doll clutched against her chest. In sleep, she looked even younger than her 9 years, vulnerable and innocent. "What do you want?" Elias asked, finally. Clara was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I want to feel safe again. I want Lucy to grow up without fear, without having to look over her shoulder everywhere she goes. I want—" She paused, struggling with words. "I want to belong somewhere again. We lost everything when James died. Our home, our neighbors, our place in the world. Up here, with you, I feel like we might be able to build something new, even with a broken-down old hermit." Clara smiled. "You're not as broken as you think you are, and you're certainly not old. What are you, 45? 41. I'm 33. Lucy's 9. We're not exactly a traditional family, but we're not completely ridiculous either." A traditional family. The words stirred something in Elias's chest, a longing he'd tried to bury so deep he'd forgotten it existed. He looked at Clara, really looked at her, seeing not just the woman he'd saved, but the person she was becoming as her health returned. Strong, intelligent, capable, beautiful in a quiet, understated way that had nothing to do with youth or fashion. "There's something else you should know," he said, "about those men who are hunting you. I think I might know how to stop them." Clara went very still. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I wasn't always a hermit. Before I came up here, I was a deputy marshal. I know how men like that think, how they operate. And I know how to make them go away permanently." You're talking about killing them. I'm talking about protecting you and Lucy, whatever that takes. Clara stared at him for a long moment, and Elias wondered if he'd revealed too much of the darkness that still lived inside him. But when she spoke, her voice was steady. I won't ask you to become a killer for us. I've killed before, Clara, more times than I like to remember. The only difference is whether I do it with a badge or without one. The difference is why you do it, she corrected, and who you become afterward. Outside, the wind began to pick up, driving snow against the windows. Winter still held the mountain in its grip, but Elias could sense the change coming. In a few weeks, maybe a month, the passes would begin to clear. When that happened, the outside world would intrude on their fragile sanctuary. The question was whether they'd face it together, as a family, or whether Clara and Lucy would disappear from his life as suddenly as they'd entered it, leaving him alone again, with nothing but memories and regrets. Looking at Lucy sleeping peacefully by the fire, and at Clara watching her daughter with fierce maternal love, Elias made a decision that would have seemed impossible just weeks before. Whatever came next, he wouldn't face it alone, and neither would they. The wanted poster was weathered and torn, but the face drawn in rough charcoal was unmistakable. Jake Cutter, wanted for robbery, murder, and assault in 3 territories. The reward was substantial, $500 dead or alive, issued by the Territorial Marshal's office in Cheyenne. Elias had found it crumpled at the bottom of his old law enforcement papers, forgotten for 15 years, but suddenly relevant again. He studied the crude likeness while Clara recovered enough strength to sit up for longer periods and help around the cabin. "That's him," Clara said when he showed her the poster. "That's the man who killed James." She'd been sitting at the table, helping Lucy practice her letters on a piece of brown paper with a stub of pencil Elias had found in his supplies. Now she went pale, her hand trembling as she touched the drawing. "You're certain?" "I'll never forget that face. He has a scar across his left cheek and his eyes." Clara shuddered. Cold eyes, like a snake's. Lucy looked up from her writing. "Is that one of the bad men, Mama?" "Yes, baby. That's their leader. What's it say about him?" Lucy pointed to the text beneath Cutter's likeness. Elias read aloud, "Jake Cutter, age approximately 35. Known associates include William Red Morrison and Tom Banks. Wanted in connection with multiple stage robberies, cattle rustling, and murder. Last seen in the vicinity of Rock Springs, Wyoming Territory. Approach with extreme caution." "Rock Springs is only about 60 miles from where our ranch was," Clara said quietly. No wonder they knew the area so well. The poster was dated 2 years ago, which meant Cutter's gang had been operating in the region for at least that long. Elias wondered how many other families they'd terrorized, how many other homesteads they'd burned in their pursuit of easy money. "There's something else," Clara said, her voice hesitant. "James mentioned it once, but I didn't pay much attention at the time. He said one of the men, asking about our land, had been asking about you too." Elias looked up sharply. "About me?" "Not by name, but he described a man who matched your description, asking if anyone knew about a hermit living up in the high country. James thought it was strange, said the man seemed very interested in whether this hermit might be armed, whether he might cause trouble." A chill ran down Elias's spine that had nothing to do with the mountain cold. "How long ago was this?" "Maybe 6 months. Right around the time they first approached us about selling the ranch." 6 months. That would have been late summer, when the mountain passes were still clear and travel was easier. If Cutter's gang had been asking about him specifically, it meant they knew more about his past than he'd realized. It also meant their presence on the mountain wasn't entirely coincidental. "Mama." "What's wrong?" Lucy had stopped practicing her letters and was looking between the adults with growing concern. "Nothing, baby," Clara said, but her voice lacked conviction. Elias folded the poster and tucked it into his shirt pocket. "Clara, I need to know everything you can remember about these men. How many, what they looked like, how they were armed. Over the next hour, Clara provided as much detail as she could recall. Besides Cutter, there had been 5 other men. Red Morrison was easy to describe, a giant of a man with flaming red hair and beard, missing 2 fingers on his left hand. Tom Banks was thin and nervous, constantly chewing tobacco and spitting. The others were less memorable, but all carried multiple weapons and rode good horses. They weren't common drifters, Clara observed. Their gear was too expensive, their horses too well bred. These were men making good money at their trade. And they seemed to know the area well, too well. They knew about the old mining trails, the winter camps, even which ranchers might be sympathetic to their cause and which ones might fight back. As Clara spoke, Elias felt pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to fit together. Cutter's gang wasn't just randomly terrorizing homesteaders, they were working systematically, with inside knowledge and specific goals. The question was what those goals might be, and how his own past connected to their current activities. That afternoon, while Lucy napped and Clara rested, Elias climbed to a rocky outcrop above his cabin that provided a clear view of the approaches from below. The snow was still deep, but he could see signs that spring was coming, ice beginning to break up on the streams, patches of bare ground appearing on south-facing slopes. In another month, maybe less, the passes would be clear enough for determined men on horseback to reach his mountain sanctuary. When that happened, he needed to be ready. He was so lost in thought that he almost missed the movement in the tree line below. A flash of color that didn't belong, red, like a man's shirt or coat. Elias lay flat against the rocks and watched, patient as a hunter waiting for game. Their movement again, more cautious this time. Someone was down there, watching his cabin from concealment. As Elias observed, he made out at least 2 figures, possibly 3, positioned to observe the approaches to his home. His blood ran cold. Somehow, despite the winter storms and treacherous terrain, Cutter's men had found them. Elias worked his way carefully back down to the cabin, using terrain and trees to mask his movement. When he slipped inside, Clara took one look at his face and knew something was wrong. "What is it?" "We've got company, at least 2 men, maybe more, watching us from the woods." Clara's face went white. "How did they find us?" "I don't know, but they're here." Elias was already moving, gathering weapons and ammunition from his hidden cache. "We need to be ready." "Ready for what?" "Whatever they're planning." Lucy stirred from her nap, rubbing her eyes sleepily. "Mr. Elias? What's happening?" "Nothing for you to worry about, little one," Elias said, forcing calm into his voice. "Just some visitors, who might not be very friendly." Clara understood immediately. She gathered Lucy close, her maternal instincts taking over. "What do we do?" "First, we wait. They're just watching right now, probably trying to figure out how many of us there are and how well we're armed. They won't move until they're confident they can win. And then we show them they're wrong." As if summoned by his words, a voice called out from the woods, distant but clear in the still mountain air. "Elias Crow, we know you're in there." The use of his full name confirmed Elias's worst fears. These men knew exactly who he was and had come here specifically for him. But how had they connected him to Clara and Lucy? "We just want to talk," the voice continued. "No need for anyone to get hurt." Elias positioned himself at a window where he could see the tree line. "What do you want?" he called back. "Like I said, just to talk. You've got something that belongs to us." Clara gripped his arm. "They mean me and Lucy. I know." Elias's voice was grim. "But they're not getting you." "Maybe we should run," Clara whispered. "There might be a back way out." "There's nowhere to run to," Elias replied. "The snow's still too deep in the high passes, and they'd track us down before we made it to the valley. Our best chance is to make our stand here, where I know the ground and have supplies. But there are only 3 of us, and Lucy's just a child." There are two of us, Elias corrected, and we have advantages they don't know about. He showed Clara the weapons he'd hidden throughout the cabin, rifles positioned at strategic windows, revolvers within easy reach, ammunition distributed so they couldn't be caught without firepower. His years of law enforcement had taught him to always prepare for the worst, and his time as a hermit had given him plenty of opportunity to fortify his position. "You know how to shoot?" he asked. "James taught me. I'm not expert, but I can hit what I aim at." "That's all we need," the voice from the woods called out again, closer this time. "We're not going away, Crow. You can make this easy or hard, but one way or another, we're settling this today." Lucy had been listening to this exchange with wide, frightened eyes. Now she tugged on Elias's sleeve. "Mr. Elias," she whispered, "are they going to hurt us?" Elias knelt down so he could look her in the eye. "Not if I can help it, Lucy. But I need you to be very brave and do exactly what your mama and I tell you. Can you do that?" Lucy nodded solemnly. "Are you going to fight them?" "If I have to." "Will you win?" The simple faith in her question nearly broke his heart. "I'm going to try my best." "Good," Lucy said with 9-year-old certainty. "Mama says you're the strongest, bravest man she ever met. I think you can beat anybody." Clara's eyes filled with tears at her daughter's words, and Elias felt something shift inside his chest, a fierce, protective instinct, stronger than anything he'd felt since his own daughter had died. These people had become his family, and no one was going to take them away from him. Not Jake Cutter, not his gang of murderers and thieves, not anyone. "Crow." The voice was much closer now, maybe 50 yards from the cabin. "Last chance to do this peaceful-like." Elias checked his rifle one final time, then called back, "I'm listening." "Send out the woman and the kid. Do that, and we'll consider your debt paid." "What debt?" "You know what debt. 15 years' worth of interest. And now it's time to collect." The words hit Elias like a physical blow. 15 years. That could only mean one thing. This wasn't just about Clara and Lucy. This was about his past, about something that had happened before he became a hermit, before he'd tried to bury Elias Crow, the lawman, beneath the identity of Elias Crow, the mountain man. But what debt could he possibly owe to Jake Cutter? And how had Cutter tracked him down after all these years? The answers would have to wait. Right now, the only thing that mattered was keeping Clara and Lucy safe. Everything else, his past, his secrets, his long-buried guilt would be settled when the shooting started. And from the sound of movement in the woods around his cabin, that was going to be very soon. The letters were tied with a faded blue ribbon, hidden beneath loose floorboards under Elias's bed. He'd kept them all these years, though he wasn't sure why, perhaps as punishment, perhaps as the only proof that his old life had actually existed. Clara found them while they were preparing defensive positions around the cabin. She'd been helping him move furniture to block windows when the board had creaked ominously under her weight. "There's something under here," she said, kneeling to examine the loose planks. "Leave it," Elias said quickly, but she'd already worked one board free. The packet of letters lay in the shallow space between the floor joists, along with a few other mementos from his previous life: a child's drawing of a horse, a woman's hair ribbon, a small silver locket. Clara picked up the letters carefully, as if they might crumble at her touch. The handwriting on the top envelope was feminine, educated, the ink faded but still legible. "My beloved Elias." "I'm sorry," she said, starting to put them back. "I didn't mean to pry. It's all right." Elias took the letters from her, feeling their familiar weight. "They're from my wife, Sarah. I should have burned them years ago." "Why didn't you?" "I don't know. Maybe because they're all I have left of her." Clara watched him handle the letters with careful reverence. Would you like to tell me about her?" Outside, they could hear the outlaws moving through the woods, positioning themselves for whatever assault they were planning. But in this moment, surrounded by reminders of his past, Elias found himself wanting to share the story he'd kept locked inside for so long. Sarah was a schoolteacher. he began, settling the letters back into their hiding place. Came west from Boston to teach in a frontier town where I was the deputy marshal. She was everything I wasn't: educated, refined, patient. I never understood what she saw in a rough lawman like me. What was she like? Smart, funny. She could make me laugh even on the worst days. Elias smiled at the memory. She used to say I took myself too seriously, that I carried the weight of the whole world on my shoulders. She was probably right. And Emma? Emma was just like her mother, curious about everything, always asking questions. She wanted to know how everything worked, why people did the things they did. Sarah said she'd make a fine teacher someday, or maybe a doctor. Clara listened with the gentle attention she gave to Lucy's stories, and gradually Elias found himself sharing details he'd never spoken aloud. How Sarah would wait up for him when he was late, returning from pursuing criminals. How Emma would practice her letters by writing him notes to find when he came home. How they'd planned to move to a bigger town where Sarah could start a proper school and Emma could have friends her own age. We were going to buy a house with a white picket fence, Elias said, embarrassed by how naive it sounded now. Sarah had it all planned out: where we'd put the garden, which room would be Emma's, where I'd build a workshop. It seems foolish now, but back then it felt like the most important thing in the world. It doesn't sound foolish at all, Clara said softly. It sounds like love. Love wasn't enough to save them. Love is never enough to save people from dying, Elias. But it's everything when it comes to making life worth living while we're here. Before Elias could respond, Lucy's voice called from the window where she was keeping watch. Someone's coming, a man with a white flag. Elias and Clara moved quickly to the front window. Sure enough, a lone figure was approaching the cabin, carrying what appeared to be a white cloth tied to a stick. As he drew closer, Elias could see it was one of Cutter's men, not Cutter himself, but a thin, nervous-looking individual who matched Clara's description of Tom Banks. "What do you want?" Elias called out when the man was within shouting distance. "Parley," Banks called back. "Boss wants to make you an offer." "I'm listening." "Face to face, just you and him, no weapons, out in the clearing." Elias considered this. It was probably a trap, but it might also be an opportunity to learn more about what Cutter really wanted, and why he kept talking about a 15-year-old debt. "I'll think about it," he called back. "Boss says you got 10 minutes to decide." Banks retreated to the tree line, leaving Elias to weigh his options. Clara moved close to him, her voice low and urgent. "Don't do it. It's obviously a trap." "Maybe. But it might also be a chance to end this without a fight. You don't believe that?" "No," Elias admitted. "I don't. But I need to know what this is really about, why he's so determined to get to you and Lucy, and what he meant about a 15-year debt." Clara studied his face. "There's something you're not telling me, something about your past that connects to all this." She was right, of course. The timing was too convenient, Cutter's knowledge too specific. Somewhere in his past as a lawman, Elias had crossed paths with Jake Cutter or someone connected to him. But 15 years was a long time, and he'd arrested dozens of men, killed several others in the line of duty. It was impossible to remember them all. "There might be," he admitted, "but I honestly don't know what it could be." Lucy had been listening to this conversation with the intense focus she brought to all adult discussions. Now she spoke up from her position by the window. "Maybe the letters would help you remember," she suggested. "Mama says when she can't remember something important, she looks at Papa's letters. They help her think about the old times." It wasn't a bad idea. Sarah had been meticulous about documenting their life together, recording not just personal matters, but details about his work, the cases he'd handled, the criminals he'd pursued. If there was a connection to Cutter in his past, it might be mentioned in her correspondence. Elias retrieved the packet of letters and began looking through them quickly, searching for any mention of names or cases that might connect to his current situation. Most were personal expressions of love, domestic concerns, news about Emma's progress in school. But scattered throughout were references to his professional duties. April 15th, 1859, he read aloud. Elias left today to pursue the gang that robbed the bank in Laramie. He expects to be gone at least a week, following their trail into the Badlands. September 3rd, 1859, the trial of the Morrison brothers concluded today. Elias testified about their capture, and both men were sentenced to hang. I'm glad they're off the streets, but I worry about what their associates might do for revenge. November 20th, 1859. There was trouble in town today. Some of Red Morrison's old gang tried to break him out of jail before his execution. Elias and the other deputies fought them off, but not before several men were killed. Elias won't talk about it, but I can see it weighs on him. Elias stopped reading, a cold certainty settling in his stomach. Red Morrison, the same Red Morrison that Clara had described as one of Cutter's men. The huge redhead with the missing fingers. "What is it?" Clara asked, seeing his expression. "I think I know what this is about." Elias set the letters aside, pieces of a 15-year-old puzzle finally falling into place. Red Morrison was one of the outlaws I arrested back in '59. He was sentenced to hang, but apparently he escaped somehow. If he's riding with Cutter now, he's here for revenge, Clara finished. Not just revenge, justice in his mind. I cost him 15 years of freedom, maybe more. In the outlaw code, that's a debt that has to be paid. But why involve us? Why not just come after you directly? Because they know the best way to hurt a lawman isn't to kill him, it's to make him watch while you destroy everything he's trying to protect. The realization hit all three of them at the same time. This wasn't just about capturing Clara and Lucy, or even about settling an old score with Elias. It was about making him suffer the same loss he'd inflicted on Red Morrison, the loss of family, of everything that mattered. "Mr. Elias," Lucy said in a small voice, "does that mean they're going to hurt us?" Elias knelt down beside her, taking her small hands in his large, scarred ones. "Not if I can help it, Lucy. I promise you that. But there are more of them than there are of us. Numbers aren't everything in a fight. Sometimes what matters more is who has the most to lose." And looking at Clara and Lucy, these two people who had somehow become more important to him than his own life, Elias knew that in this fight he definitely had the most to lose, which might just be the advantage he needed to win. The sheriff's badge was tarnished black with age, but the five-pointed star was still clearly visible beneath 15 years of neglect. Elias had kept it wrapped in oiled cloth at the very bottom of his old trunk, along with the commission papers that had once made him Deputy U.S. Marshal Elias Crow. Clara stared at the badge in shock. "You were a federal marshal." "Deputy Marshal," Elias corrected, though the distinction felt meaningless now. 15 years ago, in another life. "But you said you were just a town deputy." "I lied." Elias turned the badge over in his hands, feeling its familiar weight. "I was federal law, operating out of Cheyenne. My jurisdiction covered most of Wyoming Territory and parts of Colorado and Nebraska." Lucy looked between them with confused 9-year-old eyes. "What does that mean?" "It means," Clara said slowly, "that Mr. Elias was one of the most important lawmen in the whole territory. It means he hunted the worst criminals, the ones who crossed state lines and thought they could outrun local sheriffs. It means," Elias added grimly, "that I made a lot of enemies, more than I realized, apparently. The 10 minutes Cutter had given him were nearly up, but this revelation changed everything. If Cutter and his men knew about his past as a federal marshal, they weren't just here for revenge over Red Morrison's arrest. They were here because they saw an opportunity to settle scores with the man who had been their most effective pursuer for nearly a decade. "How many of them did you arrest?" Clara asked. "Dozens. Killed maybe half a dozen in gunfights." Elias pinned the badge to his shirt, feeling 15 years of civilian life fall away like an old coat. "But if they know who I really am, if they've been planning this..." He was interrupted by Tom Banks calling from the tree line. "Time's up, Crow. Boss wants an answer." Elias moved to the window. "Tell your boss I'll meet him, but not out in the open, too easy for your friends to put a bullet in my back. He can come to the cabin alone and unarmed." "No deal," Banks shouted back. "Clearing or nothing." "Then nothing it is." Banks disappeared back into the woods, and within minutes they could hear men moving through the trees, taking up positions around the cabin. Clara and Lucy huddled together near the fireplace, while Elias made final preparations for the siege. "There's something else you need to know," he said as he checked the loads in his rifles. "If they know about my federal commission, they probably know about other things too. Things that might make them even more determined to see me dead." "What things?" Before Elias could answer, a new voice called out from the woods, deeper, more commanding than Banks's nervous tone. This would be Jake Cutter himself. "Deputy Marshal Elias Crow." The title was spoken with mocking emphasis. "Been a long time since anyone called you that, hasn't it?" "Not long enough, Cutter." "Oh, you remember me then. I wondered if you might. After all, it was you who killed my brother." The words hit Elias like a physical blow. In all his memories of arrests and gunfights, he'd somehow missed the most important connection of all. Jake Cutter wasn't just another outlaw seeking revenge for Red Morrison's capture. He was seeking vengeance for a far more personal loss. Clara saw the recognition in his face. "What is it?" "His brother," Elias said quietly. "I killed his brother." "When?" "I don't know. I killed several men over the years. It was part of the job, but I never knew Cutter had a brother among them." Outside, Cutter continued his taunts. "Billy Cutter, ring any bells, Marshal? Young kid, maybe 19, rode with the Jameson gang. You put 3 bullets in him outside Rawlins." Now, Elias remembered. Billy Cutter had been little more than a boy, but he'd been fast with a gun and stupid enough to think he could outdraw a federal marshal. The gunfight had lasted maybe 10 seconds, ending with Billy dead in the street and the rest of the Jameson gang either captured or fleeing. "I remember," Elias called back. "He drew first. It was a fair fight." "Fair." Cutter's laugh was harsh and bitter. A 19-year-old kid against the famous Elias Crow. "Everyone knew you were the fastest gun in the territory. You might as well have executed him. He made his choice when he threw in with outlaws. He was just a boy. He looked up to men like Jameson, thought the outlaw life was all adventure and easy money. You could have wounded him, taken him alive." "I could have," Elias admitted, "but I didn't, and I'm not apologizing for doing my job." The truth was more complicated than he was willing to admit to Cutter. Billy Cutter had been young, yes, but he'd also been vicious. In the weeks before their final confrontation, Billy had participated in the robbery of a stagecoach that left 2 passengers dead, including a woman traveling with her infant child. Elias had felt no mercy for him then, and he felt none now. But understanding Cutter's motivation didn't make their current situation any less dangerous. If anything, it made it worse. A man seeking justice for his gang was one thing. A man seeking vengeance for his dead brother was another entirely. "So what's your plan, Cutter?" Elias called out. "Kill me and call it even?" "Oh no, Marshal. That would be too easy, too quick." Cutter's voice carried clearly in the still mountain air. "I want you to feel what I felt when you gunned down my baby brother. I want you to watch while I take away everything you care about. These people have nothing to do with what happened between us. They do now. The way I see it, you've got yourself a new family up there. Pretty woman, sweet little girl. Kind of like the family Billy might have had if you hadn't murdered him in cold blood." Clara had gone pale, understanding the implications. Lucy pressed closer to her mother, sensing the adult fear, even if she didn't fully understand its source. "Here's what's going to happen, Marshal," Cutter continued. "You're going to come out of that cabin with your hands empty. Then you're going to watch while my boys and I have some fun with your woman. After that, maybe we'll let the little girl go, or maybe not. Depends on how cooperative you are. The crude threat sent rage coursing through Elias's veins. He'd heard similar threats before, from other desperate outlaws trying to gain an advantage. But this time, it was personal. This time, the threatened victims were people he'd come to love. "Cutter," he called back. "You want me, you can have me. But leave them out of it." "No deal, Marshal. You made this personal 15 years ago, when you killed my brother. Now I'm returning the favor." "Elias," Clara whispered, gripping his arm. "Don't even think about going out there. Whatever he's planning, it won't end with just you dying." She was right, of course. Men like Cutter didn't make deals or keep their word. Once he had Elias at his mercy, he'd kill all three of them, but not before making sure Elias suffered as much as possible. "I know," Elias said, "which means we're going to have to fight our way out of this." "Against 6 armed men? Against however many it takes." Elias checked his weapons one final time, then moved to the window that provided the best view of the surrounding woods. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the trees, creating patterns of light and shadow that would either help or hinder the coming battle. "Listen to me," he said to Clara and Lucy. "When the shooting starts, you both get down behind the stone hearth and stay there. It's the strongest part of the cabin. Bullets won't penetrate the rock." "What about you?" Lucy asked. "I'll be doing what I should have done 15 years ago, finishing the job I started." Outside, he could hear the outlaws moving into their final positions. Soon, very soon, the mountain quiet would be shattered by gunfire and violence. But this time, Elias Crow wasn't just a federal marshal doing his duty. He was a man fighting for his family. And that, he thought grimly as he settled into position, might just make all the difference. The hidden arsenal beneath Elias's cabin would have impressed even a seasoned military man. Over 15 years of mountain living, he'd accumulated enough weapons and ammunition to outfit a small army. Rifles, shotguns, revolvers, boxes of cartridges, and even a few sticks of dynamite he'd acquired for clearing rock slides from his trail. "You weren't just planning to hide up here," Clara observed as they organized the weapons. "You were planning for war." "Old habits," Elias replied, loading shells into a double-barreled shotgun. "A lawman learns to expect the worst and prepare for it." Lucy watched, wide-eyed, as they distributed firearms around the cabin. "Are all those guns really necessary?" "Let's hope not, little one, but your mama and I want to be ready for anything." The truth was, Elias had been expecting this day for 15 years. Not specifically Jake Cutter seeking revenge for his brother, but someone from his past coming to settle old scores. He'd made too many enemies in his years as a federal marshal to ever feel completely safe. Now, as afternoon shadows lengthened across the mountain, he found himself oddly grateful for his paranoid preparations. 6 desperate outlaws against 1 aging lawman should have been hopeless odds, but 6 outlaws against a well-fortified position, defended by a man with nothing left to lose, that was a different matter entirely. "Clara," he said, handing her a Winchester rifle, "you said James taught you to shoot. How good are you?" "Good enough to hit a man at 50 yards, she replied, checking the weapon's action with competent hands. "Maybe 100, if I have time to aim properly." "That'll do. Your job is to cover the windows on the north side of the cabin. Don't expose yourself, and don't waste ammunition. Wait for clear shots." "And Lucy?" "Lucy stays behind the fireplace. That stone will stop any bullet they can throw at us." As if on cue, Lucy spoke up from her position near the hearth. "What if they try to burn us out?" It was a perceptive question that demonstrated the child had been thinking tactically about their situation. "The cabin's made of green logs with a stone foundation," Elias explained. "It won't burn easily. Besides, they want me alive to suffer. Burning us out defeats their purpose." Outside, the outlaws had grown quiet. No more shouting, no more movement visible in the tree line. That was almost worse than open threats. Silence meant they were finalizing their attack plan. Elias positioned himself at the main window, facing the clearing, where he had the best view of potential approaches. His hands moved automatically, checking his weapons with the practiced efficiency of decades of experience. Winchester rifle loaded and ready, Colt .45 on his hip with a full cylinder, spare ammunition within easy reach. "Elias," Clara said quietly, "I need you to know something. In case we don't, in case things go badly." "Don't talk like that." "I have to. Lucy needs to hear this too." Clara moved to where her daughter crouched behind the stone hearth. "Baby, come here." Lucy joined them by the window, her wooden doll clutched tightly in her small arms. Clara put one arm around her daughter and reached for Elias with the other. "Whatever happens today," she said, "I want you both to know that these past weeks have been the happiest of my life since James died. Elias, you gave us more than shelter, you gave us hope. You made us feel like a family again." "Clara, let me finish. Lucy, Mr. Elias isn't just the man who saved our lives. He's the man who taught us both how to be brave again, how to care about someone besides ourselves. If something happens to me today, I want you to remember that." Lucy's eyes filled with tears. "Nothing's going to happen to you, Mama. Mr. Elias won't let it." "That's right," Elias said, his voice rough with emotion. "Nothing's going to happen to either of you, I promise." Clara looked at him steadily. "You can't promise that. But you can promise to fight as hard as you can. And I can promise the same thing. This is supposed to be my fight, not yours. We're a family now," Clara replied simply. "That means we fight together." The word family hit Elias with unexpected force. When had that happened? When had these two strangers become more important to him than his own safety? Perhaps it had been gradual, building over days of shared meals and evening conversations. Or perhaps it had happened in that first moment when Lucy had grabbed his hands and begged him to save her mother. It didn't matter when. What mattered was that it was true. A sound from outside interrupted his thoughts, the soft whinny of a horse, quickly muffled. The outlaws were moving their mounts into position, probably preparing to make their assault on horseback for greater mobility and shock value. "Here they come," Elias murmured, raising his rifle to the window. But instead of the expected charge, a single figure emerged from the tree line. It was Red Morrison, the massive red-bearded giant Clara had described. He walked slowly toward the cabin, hands visibly empty, but Elias wasn't fooled. This was psychological warfare, an attempt to draw him into premature action. "Crow," Morrison called out when he was about 30 yards from the cabin. "Boss wants to give you one last chance." "I'm listening. Come out peaceful-like, and we'll make it quick for the woman and the kid. Fight us, and we'll take our time." The threat was crude but effective. Elias felt Clara stiffen beside him, saw Lucy press closer to her mother. This was what Cutter wanted to make him choose between his own principles and the safety of those he loved. "Tell Cutter he can go to hell," Elias shouted back. Morrison laughed. "Figured you'd say that. Boss said you were always too stubborn for your own good." The big man began walking backward toward the tree line, still calling out taunts. 15 years, Marshal. 15 years Billy's been in the ground because of you. Time to pay the debt." As Morrison reached the edge of the clearing, Elias saw movement in his peripheral vision. Another figure, Tom Banks, probably was working his way through the trees toward the cabin's blind spot on the east side. "They're trying to flank us," he told Clara. "Remember what I said about not wasting ammunition. Make every shot count." Clara nodded, moving to her assigned window. "What about you? I'm going to give them something to think about." Elias had spotted a third figure moving through the woods, not being particularly careful about concealment. That carelessness would cost him. The Winchester spoke once, the shot echoing across the mountain like thunder. In the tree line, a man cried out and fell backward, clutching his shoulder. Not a killing shot, but enough to let the outlaws know their opponents weren't helpless victims. The effect was immediate. Gunfire erupted from multiple positions around the cabin, bullets smacking into the log walls and whistling through the windows. Clara returned fire from her position, her shots deliberate and well-aimed. "Stay down, Lucy," Elias called over the noise. "Keep your head behind that stone." The first phase of the battle had begun, and already Elias could see that his defensive preparations were paying off. The outlaws' shots were poorly aimed, fired more for intimidation than effect. His and Clara's return fire was forcing them to keep their heads down, disrupting whatever coordinated assault they'd planned. But this was just the opening move. The real test would come when Cutter decided to commit his men to a full assault. "How many can you see?" Clara called from her window. "At least 4, maybe 5. Elias worked the lever of his Winchester, chambering another round. "They're staying in cover for now, but that won't last." As if responding to his words, the gunfire suddenly intensified. Bullets shattered the remaining glass in the windows and chewed splinters from the doorframe. This wasn't random shooting, it was covering fire for something else. Through the chaos, Elias heard the sound he'd been dreading. Horses at full gallop, coming fast across the clearing. Cutter had decided on a mounted assault, using speed and shock to overwhelm their defensive position. "Here they come," he shouted, swinging his rifle toward the main window. 2 riders burst from the tree line, low over their horses' necks, revolvers blazing. Elias recognized Red Morrison on the lead horse, his massive frame making an unmistakable target. The second rider was smaller, younger, probably one of Cutter's newer recruits. Elias took careful aim at Morrison and squeezed the trigger. The big man jerked in his saddle but stayed mounted, returning fire with his own revolver. Clara's rifle cracked from her position, and the second rider tumbled from his horse, rolling across the hard-packed earth of the clearing. But the mounted attack was just a diversion. While Elias and Clara focused on the horsemen, 2 more outlaws had reached the cabin walls. Elias heard them moving along the north side, looking for a way in. "Clara, 2 men coming around toward your side." She was already turning, bringing her rifle to bear on the window nearest the sounds of movement. When a face appeared in the opening, she didn't hesitate. Her shot took the man square in the chest, dropping him immediately. The second man had learned from his companion's mistake. Instead of showing himself at the window, he began chopping at the wooden shutters with an axe, trying to create his own entrance. "The axe!" Lucy called out, pointing toward a tool rack near the door. "Use the axe." But Elias was already moving. He grabbed a shotgun from his arsenal and positioned himself next to the wall, where the chopping sounds were loudest. When the blade broke through, creating a gap large enough for a man's arm, he shoved the shotgun barrel through the opening and pulled both triggers. The chopping stopped abruptly. Outside, Morrison had wheeled his horse around for another pass, but this time Elias was ready. He led the target carefully, accounting for the horse's movement, and fired. Morrison's horse went down hard, pinning the big man beneath its weight. "That's 3 down," Clara reported, reloading her rifle with practiced efficiency. "Maybe 4, which means at least 2 still out there, including Cutter himself." As if summoned by his name, Jake Cutter's voice rang out across the clearing. "Not bad, Marshal. You always were good at killing people. Come out and find out how good," Elias called back. "Oh, I intend to, but first, let me show you something." A new sound reached their ears, the crackling of flames. Smoke began to drift past the windows, and Elias realized with growing alarm that Cutter had found a way around the cabin's fire-resistant construction. "The roof," he muttered, then louder. "He's trying to smoke us out." Clara looked up at the ceiling with concern. "I thought you said the cabin wouldn't burn." "The logs won't, but if he's got something burning on the roof pitch maybe, or oil-soaked rags, the smoke could force us out." Already the air inside the cabin was growing thick and acrid. Lucy began coughing, and Clara moved to comfort her daughter while keeping watch at her window. "What do we do?" Elias considered their options. Stay inside and risk suffocating from smoke, or go outside and face Cutter's remaining men in open ground. Neither choice was appealing, but at least outside they'd have room to maneuver. "We go out," he decided, "but we do it on our terms, not his." He began gathering weapons and ammunition, preparing for a fighting retreat. "Clara, can you handle 2 rifles, if I have to? Take the Winchester and the Spencer. Lucy, you stick close to your mama, no matter what happens. What about you? I'm going to give Mr. Cutter the fight he's been wanting for 15 years. The smoke was getting thicker now, and flames were beginning to lick down through cracks in the roof. Soon the cabin would be uninhabitable, regardless of its stone foundation and green logs. "When we go out," Elias said, checking his weapons one final time, "we go fast and we go together. Head for those rocks about 50 yards north of the cabin. It's good cover, and we can see all the approaches." Clara nodded, her face pale but determined. Lucy clutched her wooden doll and tried to look brave, though Elias could see the fear in her young eyes. "Ready?" he asked. They moved to the door, weapons in hand, preparing for the desperate run that would determine whether they lived or died. Outside, Jake Cutter was waiting with at least one other gunman, probably positioned to cut them down the moment they showed themselves. But they had no choice. The cabin was becoming a death trap, and their only hope lay in reaching the rocks before Cutter's remaining men could react. Elias took a deep breath, said a quick prayer for the family he'd found so unexpectedly, and prepared to kick open the door. The final confrontation was about to begin. The family photograph was creased and faded, but Sarah and Emma's faces still smiled out from the old tintype with the warmth that had sustained Elias through 15 years of loneliness. He'd kept it in his shirt pocket through every gunfight, every lonely night, every moment when the weight of his isolation threatened to crush him completely. Now, as smoke filled the cabin and flames began to eat through the roof, he touched the photograph one last time before kicking open the door. "Go, go, go!" They burst from the burning cabin like creatures fleeing hell itself. Clara ran with Lucy pressed close to her side, both rifles clutched in her free hand. Elias came last, covering their retreat with rapid fire from his Winchester. The first shots came from the tree-line muzzle flashes in the growing dusk as Cutter's remaining men opened up. Bullets whined past their heads and kicked up dirt at their feet, but somehow they reached the rocks without being hit. "Down!" Elias shouted, pulling Clara and Lucy behind the largest boulder. The stone formation provided excellent cover, a natural fortress of granite that would stop any bullet the outlaws could fire. But it also trapped them in a relatively small area, with limited options for escape. "How many are left?" Clara gasped, trying to catch her breath. "At least 2, maybe 3. Elias peered around the edge of their cover, studying the muzzle flashes. "Cutter's there, in that cluster of pines, and someone else probably banks over by the big oak. What about Morrison? Still pinned under his horse, if he's alive at all." As if to prove him wrong, a booming voice called out from the clearing. "I'm still here, Marshal. Takes more than a horse to kill Red Morrison." Elias risked a quick look and saw the big man had somehow freed himself from his fallen mount. Morrison was bleeding from several wounds, but still mobile, still dangerous. He'd taken cover behind his dead horse and was working his way slowly toward their position. "That makes 3 for certain," Elias muttered. Lucy had pressed herself against the back of the largest boulder, still clutching her wooden doll. The child's face was streaked with tears and soot, but her eyes held a determination that reminded Elias painfully of his own daughter's courage. "Mr. Elias," she whispered, "are we going to die?" The question deserved an honest answer. "I don't know, Lucy, but I promise you this, if we do, it won't be without a fight." "My papa would have fought for us too," she said with surprising calm. "Mama told me so. She said he would have done anything to protect us." "Your papa was a good man," Elias replied, "and he raised a brave daughter." Clara had been listening to this exchange while keeping watch for movement in the trees. Now she turned to Elias with tears in her eyes. "No matter what happens," she said, "I want you to know that you kept your promise. You did save us, not just from dying in the cold, but from giving up hope." Before Elias could respond, Jake Cutter's voice rang out across the clearing. Touching scene, Marshal. Family reunions always make me sentimental. What do you want, Cutter? You know what I want. I want you to suffer the way I suffered when you murdered my brother. Your brother chose his path, just like you're choosing yours. Billy was 19 years old. He deserved a chance to grow up, to change his ways. Elias had heard this argument before, from other outlaws trying to justify their crimes. He made his choice when he drew on me. I didn't start that fight. You didn't have to finish it the way you did. You could have wounded him, taken him alive. Like you took James Monroe alive? Clara called out suddenly, her voice fierce with anger. Like you gave him a chance to surrender. The silence that followed was profound. Then Cutter laughed a sound without humor or warmth. The widow speaks. Tell me, Mrs. Monroe, did your husband beg before we shot him? Did he cry for his precious wife and daughter? Clara's face went white with rage. She raised her rifle, but Elias caught her arm. Don't let him bait you, he said quietly. That's what he wants, to make us angry, make us careless. He killed James, she whispered. He admitted it. I know, and he'll pay for it. But not if we throw our lives away in anger. Morrison's voice boomed from behind his dead horse. Enough talking. Let's finish this. The big man rose from cover, a revolver in each hand, and began advancing across the clearing. His wounds had slowed him but not stopped him, and his size made him a terrifying opponent even at a distance. Elias took careful aim and fired. Morrison staggered but kept coming, returning fire with both guns. One of his bullets struck the rock inches from Lucy's head, sending granite chips flying. Clara's rifle cracked, and Morrison spun around, clutching his right shoulder. But still he came on, driven by 15 years of hatred and the outlaw code that demanded vengeance for fallen comrades. He's not stopping, Clara said, working the lever of her Winchester. Big men like that take a lot of killing, Elias replied grimly. He fired again, and this time Morrison went down hard, rolling behind a fallen log. But the respite was brief. From the tree line, Cutter and Banks had begun their own advance, moving from tree to tree in a coordinated assault. Soon the three outlaws would have them surrounded, caught in a crossfire with no escape route. We can't stay here, Elias realized. They're going to pin us down and pick us off. Where can we go? Elias studied the terrain around their rocky fortress. About 100 yards upslope, the mountainside became steep and heavily forested, difficult ground that would favor defenders over attackers. If they could reach those trees, they might be able to disappear into the wilderness until the outlaws gave up the chase. Up the mountain, he said, into the heavy timber, but we'll have to move fast, and we'll be exposed for about 50 yards. Clara looked at Lucy, then back at Elias. She'll have to. As if sensing their plan, Cutter called out again. Running away, Marshal. That's not the Elias Crow I remember, the famous gunfighter, afraid of a fair fight. The taunt stung because it contained a grain of truth. 15 years ago, Elias would have met Cutter's challenge head-on, settling their dispute with gun smoke and blood. But 15 years ago, he'd had only himself to worry about. Now he had a family to protect. Mr. Elias, Lucy said softly, I can run really fast if I have to. I know you can, little one. When I say go, you run straight up that hill and don't look back, no matter what you hear behind you. The child nodded solemnly, tucking her wooden doll inside her coat for safekeeping. Elias checked his weapons one final time, counting ammunition and considering their chances. Not good, but not hopeless either. They were fighting for more than their lives now. They were fighting for the future they'd glimpsed in those peaceful weeks inside the cabin. A future worth dying for, if necessary. But first, worth fighting for with everything they had. Lucy's act of courage came when they needed it most. As Elias and Clara prepared for their desperate run to the tree line, the 9-year-old child did something that would change the course of the battle and prove she was truly part of this family. Wait, she whispered, pulling her wooden doll from inside her coat. I have an idea. Before either adult could stop her, Lucy stood up behind their rocky cover and hurled the carved figure as hard as she could toward the fallen log where Red Morrison was hiding. The doll landed with a soft thud in the pine needles, clearly visible in the fading light. Morrison, thinking he was seeing movement, immediately opened fire on the harmless toy. The big man rose from cover to get a better angle, exposing himself completely. Elias didn't waste the opportunity. His Winchester spoke once, and Red Morrison fell backward, this time for good. "Lucy," Clara gasped, "you could have been killed." "I knew Mr. Elias would protect me," the child replied simply. "And besides, Sarah, my doll, she wanted to help too." The sacrifice of the wooden doll, her last connection to her father, left them all momentarily speechless. But there was no time for sentiment. With Morrison down, Cutter and Banks would be even more desperate to finish what they'd started. "Now!" Elias shouted. "Run!" They broke from cover simultaneously, Clara pulling Lucy along, while Elias provided covering fire. The upslope terrain was treacherous, loose rock and fallen timber that threatened to trip them with every step, but fear gave them speed and sure footing. Gunfire erupted behind them as Cutter and Banks realized their quarry was escaping. Bullets whined overhead and splintered tree bark around them, but the range was long and the light was failing. Most of the shots went wide. They were almost to the tree line when Lucy stumbled. Clara tried to catch her daughter but couldn't maintain her balance while carrying both rifles. They went down together in a tangle of arms and legs, sliding several feet downslope on the loose scree. "Clara, Lucy!" Elias turned back, abandoning his own run for cover. "I'm okay," Lucy called out, struggling to her feet. "Mama twisted her ankle." Clara was trying to stand, but her left leg wouldn't support her weight. She'd wrenched something badly in the fall, and her face was pale with pain. "Go," she told Elias. "Take Lucy and get to the trees." "I'm not leaving you. You have to. She needs." Clara's words were cut short by the crack of a rifle. Tom Banks had reached effective range and was taking careful aim from a prone position near the cabin ruins. His bullet struck the ground inches from Clara's position, showering them with dirt and rock fragments. Elias made a decision that went against every tactical instinct he possessed. Instead of seeking cover, he turned and walked deliberately downslope toward Banks. His Winchester held ready but not aimed. "Banks!" he called out. "This is between Cutter and me. Let the woman and child go." The thin outlaw hesitated, clearly surprised by this development. In that moment of uncertainty, Elias closed the distance between them to less than 50 yards. "I said this is between Cutter and me," Elias repeated, his voice carrying the authority of his old badge. "You can ride away right now and live to see another sunrise." Banks looked toward the trees where Cutter was presumably positioned, waiting for orders from his leader. When none came, he made the mistake of looking back at Elias, who was no longer 50 yards away, but 30. "Too late for deals, Marshal," Banks snarled, swinging his rifle toward this new target. But 15 years of mountain living hadn't dulled Elias's reflexes. His Winchester was up and firing before Banks could complete his aim. The outlaw spun around and collapsed, his unfired rifle spinning away across the rocky ground. That left only Jake Cutter. "Impressive, Marshal," Cutter's voice echoed from somewhere in the darkening forest. "But it changes nothing. I still have what you want most." Elias felt ice in his veins as he realized what Cutter meant. While he'd been dealing with Banks, the outlaw leader had somehow circled around behind them. Clara and Lucy were between Elias and Cutter now, trapped in the open with nowhere to run. "Let them go, Cutter," Elias called out. "Your fight is with me." "My fight is with everything you care about." Cutter emerged from the trees about 20 yards above Clara and Lucy's position, his revolver trained on the helpless woman and child. "The way I see it, you took my family 15 years ago. Now it's my turn." Clara had managed to stand despite her injured ankle, positioning herself protectively in front of Lucy. Even facing death, she was every inch the fierce mother, ready to sacrifice herself for her child. "Please," she said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "Let my daughter go. She's just a little girl. She never hurt anyone." "Neither did my brother Billy," Cutter replied coldly. "But that didn't stop your precious Marshal from gunning him down in cold blood." "Your brother was an outlaw and a killer," Elias shouted, "just like you." "He was family." Cutter's voice cracked with 15 years of suppressed grief and rage. "He was all I had left after our parents died, and you took him away from me." For the first time, Elias heard something other than hatred in Jake Cutter's voice. Pain, loss, the same anguish that had driven Elias himself to this mountain 15 years ago. "I know what it's like to lose family," Elias said, slowly working his way up slope while keeping his rifle trained on Cutter. "I know how it feels to blame yourself, to want someone else to pay for your pain. You don't know anything. I lost my wife and daughter to cholera while I was out chasing men like your brother. I blamed myself for years, thought if I'd been home, if I'd chosen family over duty, they might still be alive." Cutter's gun hand wavered slightly. "That's not the same thing, isn't it? We both lost the people we loved most. We both spent years nursing our anger and grief instead of trying to heal." Elias was close enough now to see Cutter's face clearly in the fading light. The outlaw leader was younger than he'd expected, probably no more than 35, with eyes that held too much pain for such a young man. "The difference is," Elias continued, "I found something worth living for again. Clara and Lucy gave me back my reason to care about tomorrow. What you're planning to do, it won't bring Billy back. It'll just create more grief, more loss." "Maybe," Cutter said, his voice quieter now but no less determined, "but at least you'll know how it feels to watch your family die." The outlaw's finger tightened on the trigger, and Elias knew he was out of time for words. In one fluid motion, he raised his Winchester and fired, just as Cutter's revolver boomed in the mountain stillness. Both men fell. Lucy's scream pierced the sudden quiet, a sound of pure terror that echoed off the surrounding peaks. Clara was on the ground, clutching her shoulder where Cutter's bullet had found its mark. But she was alive, conscious, trying to comfort her daughter despite her own pain. Elias struggled to his feet, checking himself for wounds. Cutter's shot had been hurried, thrown off by his own bullet's impact. The outlaw lay motionless among the pine needles, his long quest for vengeance finally ended. The mountain was quiet again, save for the distant crackle of flames from the burning cabin and the soft whimpers of a frightened child. But they were alive. All three of them were alive. And for the first time in 15 years, Elias Crow felt like he truly had something worth fighting for again. The plans for their new homestead were drawn on pieces of bark with charcoal from the burned cabin, but they represented something far more precious than any architect's blueprint. Dreams made tangible, hope given form. "The main house should face south," Clara said, pointing to her rough sketch with a bandaged hand. "That way, we'll get the morning sun in the kitchen and afternoon light in the parlor. And my room has to have a window facing the meadow," Lucy added seriously, "so I can watch for deer and rabbits." Elias studied their drawings with the careful attention of a man who had learned to value such simple pleasures. 3 weeks had passed since the gunfight that ended Jake Cutter's quest for revenge. Clara's shoulder wound was healing well, and Lucy had recovered from the trauma with the resilience that children somehow possessed. They were living in a hastily constructed lean-to while making plans for something more permanent. The burned cabin could be rebuilt, but they decided on a new location closer to the creek, with better views of the valley below and more room for the garden Clara wanted to plant. "We'll need to start cutting timber soon," Elias said, "before the sap rises and makes the wood harder to work." "Will you teach me how to use an axe?" Lucy asked. "I want to help build our house." "Our house." The words still sent a warm shock through Elias's chest. After 15 years of solitude, the simple pronoun carried more weight than any legal document. "I think that can be arranged," he said with a smile. "Though you'll start with smaller tools and work your way up." Clara had been watching this exchange with quiet satisfaction. Her recovery had been remarkable, not just from her physical wounds, but from the deeper healing that came with finally feeling safe again. The haunted look that had shadowed her eyes for months was gone, replaced by something Elias had rarely seen in his hard life: genuine contentment. "There's something we need to discuss," she said, setting down her piece of bark, "about what people will say when they find out we're living together." "Let them talk," Elias replied. "Gossip never hurt anyone." "It might hurt Lucy when she's older. Children can be cruel about things they don't understand." Lucy looked up from her own architectural efforts, a detailed plan for a chicken coop that seemed to require more engineering than most railroad bridges. "Are you going to get married?" she asked with characteristic directness. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither adult had been quite ready to voice. They'd been functioning as a family for weeks now, but the legal and social formalities remained unaddressed. "Would you like that?" Clara asked her daughter carefully. "Yes," Lucy said without hesitation. "Then Mr. Elias would really be my papa, and no one could say it wasn't proper." Elias felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Lucy, I could never replace your real father." "I don't want you to replace him," she interrupted. "I want you to be my papa too. Is that allowed?" Clara reached over to stroke her daughter's hair. "Hearts are big enough for more than one love, baby. Your Papa James will always be part of you, and now Mr. Elias can be part of you too, so we can be a real family." "We already are a real family," Elias said quietly. "Marriage would just make it official for everyone else." Clara looked at him with those dark eyes that had become so precious to him. "Is that a proposal, Mr. Crow?" "I suppose it is, Mrs. Monroe, though I'm not sure I'm doing it properly." "There's no proper way to propose to a widow with a 9-year-old daughter while living in a lean-to on a mountain," Clara replied with a laugh. "I think you're doing just fine." "Is that a yes?" "That's a yes." Lucy let out a whoop of joy that echoed across the mountain meadow, scaring a family of elk that had been grazing nearby. "Can we have the wedding here? In our meadow?" "Where else?" Clara said. "This is where we found each other. This is where we belong." As spring deepened into early summer, they began the work of building their new life together. The house rose slowly but steadily, each timber cut and placed with the care of people who intended to live in it for the rest of their lives. Lucy proved surprisingly handy with tools, her small size allowing her to work in spaces too cramped for the adults. Clara established her garden in the rich soil near the creek, planting vegetables and herbs with the enthusiasm of someone who had never been certain she'd live to see a harvest. She also began treating minor ailments for folks in the valley below. Word had spread that the mountain hermit had taken a wife with medical knowledge. Elias found himself slowly reconnecting with the wider world he'd abandoned 15 years earlier. Neighbors began stopping by occasionally, drawn by curiosity about the famous shootout that had ended Jake Cutter's reign of terror. He discovered that his reputation as a federal marshal had grown in his absence, elevated to near legendary status by time and retelling. "They say you once arrested an entire gang single-handed," Clara teased him one evening as they sat on the porch of their half-finished house. "Only 3 men, and I had help from the local sheriff. They say you could outdraw anyone west of the Mississippi. Speed isn't everything in a gunfight. Being right matters more." Lucy, who had been listening to this conversation while whittling a new doll to replace the one she'd sacrificed during the battle, looked up with serious eyes. "Are you still a marshal, Mr. Elias?" It was a question he'd been avoiding, though he'd known it would come eventually. The federal commission that had once defined his life still existed somewhere in the territorial bureaucracy. He could reclaim it with a letter to Cheyenne, return to the dangerous but important work of bringing law to the frontier. "No, Lucy, I'm not a marshal anymore. I'm just a man building a house with his family." "But what if bad men come again? What if they hurt people?" Clara and Elias exchanged glances over their daughter's head. The child had inherited her mother's compassionate nature and her adopted father's sense of justice, a potentially troublesome combination. "If bad men come," Elias said carefully, "then good people have to stand up to them. but that doesn't mean I have to wear a badge to do what's right." It was an answer that seemed to satisfy Lucy's 9-year-old sense of justice. She returned to her whittling, humming a tune her mother had taught her. The wedding took place on a perfect June morning, with wildflowers blooming in the meadow and snow-capped peaks providing a cathedral backdrop no church could match. The ceremony was performed by a traveling preacher who happened to be passing through the valley, with half a dozen neighbors serving as witnesses. Lucy served as both flower girl and ring bearer, her face glowing with the joy of finally having the complete family she'd dreamed about. She wore a new dress that Clara had sewn from fabric traded for medical services, and her hair was decorated with mountain laurel blossoms. Clara was beautiful in a simple white dress that emphasized her quiet strength and natural grace. She carried a bouquet of wildflowers picked by Lucy from their own meadow, and her eyes shone with the happiness of a woman who had found love again after believing it was lost forever. Elias wore his cleanest shirt, and the badge that had once defined his identity, not as a symbol of his authority, but as a reminder of the man he'd been and the man he'd chosen to become. As they exchanged vows in the shadow of the mountains that had sheltered them all, Elias reflected on the strange journey that had brought them together. Clara and Lucy had stumbled into his carefully ordered world of solitude and shown him that isolation wasn't the same as peace. They'd reminded him that some things were worth fighting for, worth dying for, worth living for. "Do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" the preacher asked. "I do," Elias replied, his voice steady and sure. "Do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," Clara answered, squeezing his hands. "Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Wyoming, I pronounce you husband and wife." As they kissed to seal their union, Lucy cheered and the small gathering of neighbors applauded. Mountain echoes carried the sound across the valley, announcing to the world that 3 people who had been alone had found each other and chosen to build something lasting together. That evening, as the last guests departed and Lucy fell asleep between her new parents in the big bed they'd built together, Elias lay awake, listening to the sounds of his family breathing peacefully beside him. Outside, the mountain wind whispered through the pines, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled at the moon. But the sounds no longer spoke of loneliness and isolation. They spoke of home, of belonging, of the quiet satisfaction that came from having something worth protecting. The hermit was gone, replaced by a husband and father who had learned that the strongest man was not one who could face the world alone, but one who chose to share his strength with others. Sometimes the most broken hearts do find each other in the darkest moments. Sometimes a stranger's desperation becomes the very thing that saves us all. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, we discover that love doesn't require us to be perfect, only willing to be better than we were before. In the Wyoming mountains, where winter winds could kill and summer storms could wash away a lifetime's work in minutes, 3 people had built something stronger than stone, more enduring than any structure human hands could create. They had built a family. And that, Elias Crow finally understood, was the only thing that truly lasted in this hard and beautiful world.